Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics.
Hurricane season officially underway with satellite showing exactly what we want this time of year. A lot of emptiness in the Atlantic. We all know this won't last long, however. A discussion on the top 5 things you need to have in your household starts now here on Tracking the Tropics. Hey there, folks. JB Buno here with you for another season of Tracking the Tropics. We're on to year 3. It's, of course, great to have Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth on the program, joining us from WKRG News 5 in Mobile, Alabama. A lot to get to as far as the discussion today. We're going to be hearing on some of the things that you need to have in your household, in your residence, now, ahead of that storm knocking on your front doorstep. But we're going to start with Tracking the Tropics meteorologist Ian Oliver standing by at the wall with what you need to know and a look at both satellite and radar. Hey there, Ian.
JB, good to be with you. Yeah, June the 1st, it's the start of another hurricane season. Wild to think it's our 3rd season now of Tracking the Tropics. And a big shout out to you, JB, all the hard work you've done to build out this platform. It's really formed into an awesome utility to track these storms as we do and tell you about them here on Tracking the Tropics. Every time we need to be on here, we're tracking those storms and bringing you the very latest information from the National Hurricane Center. So it's a kickoff special today. We're looking out at the Atlantic, and thankfully, that's all it is. It's a picture of the globe in the Atlantic Basin. No development expected over the next 5 days, thankfully. And that's typical for the early part of the season where we don't see quite as much tropical activity. This is a quick check of our powerful S-band radar, Max Defender 8. This is based in Central Florida. An extended range with this radar where we're tracking some heavy, much-needed rainfall across southeastern parts of Polk County, Highlands County. This is locally across the Tampa Bay area. Everybody happy to see some rainfall after what was a painfully dry month of May, but we'll be using that tool as well to carefully track storms as they approach the Gulf Coast. Of course, if you've been paying attention preseason, it was the 7th year in a row that we had a named preseason storm. That this year was Ana, who was a weak system that developed to the north and east of Bermuda and then eventually dissipated out in the open waters of the Atlantic. So not a big issue, thankfully, but that is included on the list here with our forecast for yet another very active season. Now, these are new averages. Last year, it was still 12, 6, and 3. This is new information from the National Hurricane Center with some named storms up to 14 now. That's an increase of 2. Hurricanes up 1 from 6 to now an average of 7. Thankfully, major hurricanes, those are unchanged. That's the forecast, though, from NOAA as we move into the new season. Above average once again with 13 to 20 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to as many as 5 major storms. And you can see an above average season also forecasted by Colorado State University. And 2021 to date, we've got a 1 there for named storms, but thankfully no hurricanes. Typically, we don't see those until we get into the month of July, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So where do we look in the month of June? We see the Gulf always warming up very quickly. So an area just off to our west here in west central Florida, that's where we're fairly likely to see what's typically some weaker early season storms where we see tropical storms or low-end hurricanes, big rainmakers. We could actually use that across a good portion of the state of Florida where conditions have been abnormally dry. But yeah, warm sea surface temperatures in the Gulf, that's where we're typically looking for some weak development early in the season. This is a look back at last year because we have to do that. 30 storms in total last year, the most ever in a season, but it's really not named storms that we worry about. It's just a number when they're out in the open waters of the Atlantic. But as we look towards landfall, that unfortunately was the record last year. 13 total landfalls along the United States, 5 hurricanes, and 5 of those systems made landfall just in Louisiana. 2 major hurricanes. We had a 4 and a 3, Delta and Laura. We had Cristobal, Zeta, and Marco also making landfall. But again, 13 landfalls across the southeastern United States. A very active season, and that's the forecast once again as we head on through the next 6 months. So this is when we start to expect to see a bit of an uptick in activity. It's not until the teeth of the season, I typically call it. August and September, that's when 2/3 of all tropical systems develop. First named storm on average, that's not until July 9th. First hurricane, that doesn't come until August 10th. The peak of the season statistically comes on September 10th, and that's actually fairly close to where we typically see our first major hurricane of the season, that coming on September the 4th. So here in Florida, it is tax-free week. This runs until Sunday, so this is an excellent time. We're always talking about preseason to get your hurricane plan, your hurricane kit together. If you haven't done it yet, you got a fantastic opportunity this week to pick up on some of those tax-free items. Battery-powered or hand-crank radio. This is $15 to $50. I looked on the internet for a lot of these prices, so I'm sure you can shop around and find some better deals. You might want to do that this week with the tax-free holiday occurring here. Batteries, $10 to $25. Flashlights, not candles, of course, because of that fire threat, $10 to as much as $100. You know, you can see a big spread there with flashlights. Same with first aid kits. Basic one will run you about $10. Those can go up to around $50. And also tie-down kits for manufactured or mobile homes. This can be a more expensive item. And again, you don't have to buy all these at once. It can really run up a tab as you put your hurricane kit together. That's why you can gradually, over the first part of the season, as this week, especially with the tax-free holiday, try to get this put together. Ed, I know you guys, thankfully here in Florida, we were spared the bulk of the activity last year. You had a much more active season, the northern part of the Gulf Coast. What would you put on this list?
Well, one of the pricier items I would put on there for folks who can afford it is a good solid generator. Generators after the season started to kind of fly off the shelves. I think a lot of folks bought them for their families or bought their own little Christmas gifts and through the course of the spring as well. And the supply of generators actually nationally, just like many other things, was disrupted by the pandemic last year. So the supply is relatively low, but you can still find a decent generator. A couple things that you want to include with that is make sure you, again, understand how to work your generator. We always report on folks misusing generators, misplacing generators, and that could lead to carbon monoxide issues and poisonings. We actually, unfortunately, had a couple of fatalities after Sally from folks improperly using the generators. But also it's a good thing to maybe go ahead and invest in a carbon monoxide detector for your home if you don't already have one, if you go along and buy that generator as well.
Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth joining us here from WKRG News 5 in Mobile, Alabama. JB Buno here with you in your hurricane headquarters, folks, alongside meteorologist Ian Oliver here with us at WFLA, tracking the tropics, of course, here live for our first regularly scheduled episode of the year. And what we want to do now, folks, is we want to open up this to the meteorologist Q&A portion of the program, where we're going to, of course, take your questions from social media, asking you questions, or you can ask us questions pertaining to the season, what you need for hurricane season, when we can expect some of these storms to first start sort of arriving here, and as we look here at satellite, really an empty Atlantic here. And Ed, I'm sure that you guys are hoping for a more quiet season. We know that NOAA is, of course, expecting another above-average season, but for your neck of the woods there on the Alabama Gulf Coast, it was a very tiring season, especially when you factor in Mississippi, when you factor in Louisiana too. So we're hoping that things stay quiet for a considerable amount of time here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we actually had a big sort of local conference up here even last week and kind of talking about some of the lessons learned from last year with it being so active. And a couple things I think that folks should always remember, and we press on this every single year when a storm is approaching. You know, unfortunately, nowadays, still a lot of people do make their decisions or make their plans on a storm by storm basis. And they make it based off the fact whether it's, you know, a category 1, category 2, or category 3. You know, unfortunately, we learned with Sally last year, you know, that was a category 2. And there were a lot of people around here that said, okay, it's not a major hurricane, so I'm just going to, you know, I'll be fine. But you know, a slow moving category 2 that drops 30 inches of rain, that's a high impact event. And so, you know, that's one of the big lessons that we learned. And again, these tracks that we get throughout the year, especially with these slow moving storms, they can shift very quickly, just in the matter of hours. And there's a little something that people do called anchoring, where, you know, if they're in the threat cone of a storm and then they're moved out of the cone, well, that's it. They kind of write the storm off, not really thinking that there are going to be more shifts in these tracks as they come in. So, you know, bottom line, always stay prepared and keep up to date if there's a storm, especially in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Atlantic or in the Eastern Seaboard, because again, storm tracks are never set in stone. They can change very, very quickly from update to update.
Again, Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth joining us from WKRG News 5 in Mobile, Alabama. Ian Oliver is here with us in your hurricane headquarters here, folks, in Tampa, Florida. Again, we're moments away. We're going to start taking your questions here. We're going to throw them up here on screen. Use the hashtag on screen. Hashtag Hey Ian, hashtag Hey Ed, hashtag Hey JB. We'll be looking for those here in the social media comment section. Again, this is a great opportunity if there's something that you want to know ahead of some of these storms arriving later on in the 2021 hurricane season. So file your questions here below. But Ian, just like I asked Ed about the Alabama Gulf Coast where he is, I'm going to ask you about the state of Florida, really the Tampa Bay area. We had a very active season last year. You mentioned it, 13 record U.S. landfalls with named storms. Tampa was not really impacted. Really, the state of Florida, it sticks out like a sore thumb, as we mentioned, but didn't get hit all that much here. So people here, I know, I've had conversations with people a little bit more on edge entering this season because odds are eventually Florida's going to get impacted.
Sure, you feel like the law of averages. Eventually, it's going to be us. We had last season where, unfortunately, it was Louisiana with 5 named storms. Had a great conversation with the National Hurricane Center Director, Ken Graham. That was actually in our hurricane special here at WFLA. And you'll hear from Ken Graham here on Tracking the Tropics later this season. But what he said was it easily could have been Florida. It was basically just the set of meteorological conditions last year, mostly with the placement and strength of the Bermuda High, that just kept sending systems straight up to the northern part of the Gulf Coast. Had that feature been a bit weaker, that could have allowed storms to turn a bit quicker, and then of course it could have brought the peninsula much more into play. So that's something that we'll just have to watch for during the season. What are the major features in play when we see these bursts of activity in the tropics? Last year, it was unfortunately a pattern that kept sending the strongest of the storms to the same places, which made it brutal to recover. And then, of course, just repeatedly going through that, not only a natural disaster, but also going through that during the pandemic. It was really just a perfect storm that created a lot of trouble along the northern Gulf Coast. So we'll be watching. We, of course, hope that's not the case, but it's a definite possibility. Of course, as you mentioned, it's been a while again for Florida. We'll be watching very closely over the next several months.
Of course, we're going to be watching here very closely in your hurricane headquarters. Getting to our first social media question here comes from David Fassel, hashtag HeyJB. With water temperature going up, could we see more Andrews in the future? Of course, referencing Hurricane Andrew from the 90s. And for first and foremost, Ed and Ian, I'll throw you guys both up here on screen talking about water temperatures here, sea surface temperatures especially. What do we say here for David's comment?
Well, with the Hurricane Center putting out their forecasts, they're kind of expecting us to come out of this very active La Nina phase, which really helped to energize last season, getting to a bit more of a neutral cycle. And generally that would lead to near average conditions. But you reference the water temperature. The overall Atlantic basin right now is running above average. The central Atlantic, there are some cooler spots, but as Ian and I have been, we covered storms there at FLA in the past. We know that you can get a water temperature of 78, and that can jump to 90 just in the course of a couple of weeks. So, and again, it's just that the warm water that fuels the storms. And I think not necessarily you're going to see more storms because of water temperature alone, but again, think of it as fuel. If there's more gas around, well, there's going to be enough to maybe energize these storms. And we saw many storms last year that fed off of that warm water in a low shear environment and go through these rapid intensification cycles. And Ian can talk more to this. We've seen numerous indications of that just over the last decade.
Yes, and thankfully with the upgrade to the GFS, the American Forecast Model this year, it looks like we'll have better vertical resolution of the storms. It should handle that a little bit better. That's what we'll be watching closely as we move on through the season. But something to point out, how you can't compare storm to storm or even season to season. If you think about Andrew, it's impossible for us to have an Andrew this year, of course, because we already had an Anna that occurred preseason. But Andrew was an A storm that happened in August, and that's the reason why the sea surface temperatures with Andrew were so warm. So yes, there is a direct correlation between sea surface temperature and the strength of the storm, but that was a season which wasn't active at all. If you look at last year, at the point of when Andrew occurred, which was in the middle and latter portion of August, we had many, many named storms at that point, none that were that powerful, of course, but the point being that all seasons are different. That was a season that got off to a late start in terms of when we had our first named storm, of course, hurricane and major hurricane. but that was overall a below average season. So that was kind of the point I was trying to make last year. The 30 named storms is essentially an irrelevant statistic. It's the landfalls and the impacts that matter. So hopefully, if we do see another season here where we do have many named storms, hopefully those are storms that occur out in the open waters of the Atlantic and they don't give anybody any problems. That's what we'll be looking for. But like Ed mentioned, of course, we've got a lack of an El Nino, we'll call it that, which will allow for some tropical development, and also the above average sea surface temperatures, which help stronger storms develop.
Let's take this question here. Again, we're taking questions from across the country, representing a lot of different markets, especially markets that have been impacted by hurricanes in seasons past. All-Nan here from KLFY's Facebook page in Louisiana, tuning in. All-Nan, thanks so much. Hashtag Hey Ed. Any studies on attempts to decrease the strength of storms? I don't think we've been doing this now. This is our third year of doing Tracking the Tropics. I don't think I've ever seen a question on any studies on attempts.
Once, JB. This
really?
came up one time.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You guys want to hop in here?
I was about to say, I think I was on that stream when this question came up, because I think someone asked a question about what happened if you dropped a bomb or something in the middle of a hurricane. And, this goes back to, decades old, old journal articles talking about is that something you could do in terms of cloud seeding or things of that nature. And, bottom line, you can, because these are just extremely powerful storms. A hurricane is a way for the earth to kind of regulate its temperature. So these are just big heat engines. They take in a lot of heat and they release a lot of heat. And, that's not really, an option here. The amount of power that these things generate in a single day is astronomical. So short answer, no. And I know they're in Louisiana, so obviously folks in Louisiana hyperactive when it comes to what's hyper alert and hyper vigilant this year, obviously. And even just a couple of weeks ago, what was it, Lake Charles and Lafayette just picked up about 12 to 16 inches of rain in one day. So we know the kind of effects, especially these slow-moving tropical systems can have. And so short answer is, no, that's not really something to really bank on as we move into what will probably be another busy season.
And that's a great point, Ed, because that tropical disturbance never even got a name, but there you go. It put down over a foot of rainfall in spots. It's an impactful event. And then you had Ana, which was a subtropical storm that eventually went fully tropical. It was in the open waters of the Atlantic. It was not an issue except for shipping. So you had a system that wasn't named that was very impactful, and then our first named storm of the year, which came preseason for the 7th year in a row, which had virtually no impact. So that's kind of the nuance of tropical season.
Smith Michael with the next question, joining us from WJTV in Mississippi. Hashtag Hey JB. JB, I think the New England is going to get hit more this year. I think asking or maybe stating or asking, I'm not entirely sure here, but it was interesting on our Ana stream with meteorologist Amanda Holly. We also got questions about New England, of course, about the northeastern United States. Ian, what do we think? What do we think about the chances of the Northeast seeing a storm this year? I'm looking here at your 2020 hurricane 30 storms in total graphic here, and we see that some storms eventually ventured up that way, but not too many.
Again, it's more about that main semi-permanent weather feature, the Bermuda High, its placement and intensity. Does it allow a storm to make that curve up the coast, and are there features farther off to the north from there that keep it hugging the coast? So that's probably the reason I'm sitting here. Hurricane Bob, 1991, me sitting in Westport, Massachusetts, watching the pine trees blow out of my yard. It's a long time ago. It has been a while since the Northeast has felt significant impacts, likely going back to Superstorm Sandy at this point. But these forecasts say nothing about where these storms are going or how strong they're going to be. Of course, into the category, we do have that projection, but those numbers don't look at that and say, oh, above average season, we're going to have a number of landfalls in this specific part of the country. That's something that we just can't forecast at this point. We'll have our eyes on the tropics, and we'll have to assess the situation at that point. So I wouldn't say that there's any sort of trend that would make it more or less likely for New England to be hit this year. What do you think, Ed?
No, I mean, I'm right there with you. The one thing I think a lot of folks need to remember, especially if we get these storms, even if they make landfall in the Carolinas or or the Outer Banks there or in Delmarva, you can see, especially by that point, a lot of these storms are moving very quickly. I think we saw with Faye and Isaias last year, they were able to spread some strong winds well inland. And I think it was Isaias that caused some significant power outages there across the northeast hubs. Any kind of storm, even if it makes landfall to the south, but it moves into the northeast, it's going to get a lot of attention just because you have so many major cities up there in New England and the Northeast. So these storms can carry impacts well inland. It's not just a coastal issue. So just, obviously you need the folks along the Northeast U.S. need to be as prepared and as alert as folks in the Mid-Atlantic, the Southeast, the Gulf Coast, coastal Texas. Everyone needs to treat these storms with a level of respect.
And as we look here at the map, I was also made aware, too, that we have a lot of viewers that join us from some of those inland states, particularly Arkansas. And Arkansas saw a lot of that inland activity after storms like Laura and like Zeta, storms that made their way inland. They felt those effects in Arkansas. So Little Rock, I know that Northwest Arkansas, our sister station KNWA, we have a lot of viewers that tune in. Again, we're here for you here on the first day of hurricane season 2021 to answer your questions, to have your question featured here on Tracking the Tropics. Sort of a last call for your questions. You see there on the bottom of your screen, the meteorologist Q&A. All you have to do is use one of the hashtags that we have for you today for our meteorologist joining us on Tracking the Tropics, and we can feature your comments on screen. And again, hashtag Hey Ian, hashtag Hey Ed, or hashtag Hey JB. We'll look for those comments here in the Facebook Live comments section if you want to ask a question directly to one of our two meteorologists joining us today, Ed Bloodsworth and Ian Oliver. How about Chuck Andrews here from WFLA's Facebook page in Tampa, hashtag HJB. Love your show. Thank you so much, Chuck. We really appreciate that. Will it be mandatory for a COVID-19 shot to get into a shelter if needed? I'll weigh in here on this here in a second, but either of the two of you guys would like to comment here on this question here from Chuck?
I just like to point out, we all essentially had to go through a disaster last year. You saw a little bit of what hurricane planning is like when you had to get essentially your pandemic plan and your pandemic kit together. A lot of the same things were likely in both, but you saw the rush as obviously the pandemic was really getting started, the rush at the supermarket. That right there is the reason why we always say, do it while it's quiet. Head out. Get your plan in place, have it written down so everybody in the family knows what to do if you have to put that plan into practice. But when you head out to get your hurricane kits on a nice day like this, it's the first day of hurricane season, you can go out to your supermarket, get all the stuff that you would need without any trouble. It takes a lot of the stress out of what can be a very stressful time when you have the possibility of a tropical system heading in your direction. So that's really what I would say. Take some of the lessons that we've learned from last year and add some of the same things into your hurricane kit. If you're going to be putting that together, you're going to want things like Clorox wipes, hand sanitizer, those kinds of things that maybe weren't in your hurricane kit prior to the pandemic. You might want to have those moving forward. Ed?
Yeah, one thing that actually our local emergency managers up here have told us, and they've told us that they're never going, if an emergency shelter needs to open, they're never going to want to turn someone away. But the one thing they wanted to emphasize and really, really press, just like last year, is that if going to a hurricane shelter is your first, is your main evacuation plan, if that's your first thing you think to do, it's really, then you've got a bad plan. A hurricane shelter, a public hurricane shelter, should be the last step. You should talk to neighbors, talk to family, look at reliable hotels inland, or think about those kind of things, because going to a public shelter, again, for many folks, I understand that if it's the last possible route, that's the way that will go. But all of our emergency managers are telling us that needs to be your last resort. And now is the time, especially when we're in a quiet period, to start going and making those plans for family, friends, for your pets, and things of that nature.
All right, guys, we have time for, I think, 5 more questions, maybe 5 because we only have 5 more minutes here on Tracking the Tropics. We're going to try to speed up some of the question and answer responses here from our meteorologists. How about this one here from Jessica Marie Brown Booth, hashtag AJB. What are the estimated storms this year? I'll throw this one over to Ian.
Let's get that pulled up for you. We have our forecast from NOAA, which just came out a couple of weeks ago now. Getting that pulled up, it is unfortunately for another active season. We're seeing several of them now. In fact, we've got another preseason storm. Here it is. It's coming up on your screen right now. The average season now is 14, 7, and 3. And if you were watching in previous seasons of Tracking the Tropics, you would have seen 12, 6, and 3. So that's two reasons there. One, to reflect the active stretch we've been in the tropics. We have been seeing more named storms, but also detection has got a lot better. We've got next generation weather satellites. Pretty much if something's spinning in the tropics now, we're going to see it. We're not missing anything. So that has also led to a little bit of a bump up in how many named storms that we've been seeing. So the forecast this year is for slightly above average, at least slightly to moderately above average, you could say. Low end of it is close to the average at 13, with a higher end closer to 20. About 6 to 10 hurricanes, that's the forecast from NOAA right now, and 3 to 5 major hurricanes. That was unchanged. Major hurricanes, previous average was 3, and that is still the average at 3. Colorado State's forecast, that's also for an above average season, and both of those take into account the fact that we already have had one named storm. So over the next couple of months, June, July, you can expect to see some tropical storms, perhaps some more lower end hurricanes. But once we get into the heart of the season, August, September, that first part of October, when we have very warm sea surface temperatures and typically a ripe environment for tropical development, that's where you're going to start to see your higher end hurricanes and perhaps some major start to develop.
Yeah, and just now, of course, some of the good questions are starting to come in as we're near the end of our live stream here. We're going to try to take as many of these great questions that are coming in at the end of our stream here. We're going to try to take them as quickly as possible here. Throw this one right back over to Ian and Ed if you want to chime in here as well. Sharon here, #8Ian. What determines where storms go as far as high or low pressures?
That's interesting. A lot of times it depends on the structure of a storm. The stronger a storm gets, the taller it gets. And as it gets taller, it's more the upper levels of the atmosphere that start pushing on that storm system. So that's why the National Hurricane Center not only sends the hurricane hunters and the WP3 that fly into the hurricane through the eye wall and sample the low-level structure, they also have their G4, a private jet type style that actually flies in the upper levels of the atmosphere. So depending on the exact structure of the system, the mid-levels and the upper level features play a different part. And understanding the exact setup of the atmosphere at the time the storm develops and the surrounding environment, that's what really governs where exactly that system is going to go. And that's why when a storm is brand new, hasn't really been sampled by surface observations or satellite-derived data or by the hurricane hunters, that's why it's very difficult to judge the path of a system when it's early. Once we have more data, a better sampling of what the storm looks like and a better sampling of the area around the storm, that's when you start seeing that cone getting smaller and smaller, spaghetti plots coming into more and more of a consensus.
Ed, I'm going to throw this question right over to you. #Ed from Cortland Bowley. Do you think Louisiana will see a few hurricanes this year? She did type this in all capital letters here, so we're just taking it right out of Facebook Live here, folks. My anxiety is on high alert already as a mom of 6 needing to protect her babies. Ed?
Well, obviously Louisiana getting, the chance of getting 4 or 5 landfalls is remote. But, the Northern Gulf Coast, historically speaking, is one of the most vulnerable parts of the entire Atlantic basin when it comes to landfalling tropical systems. I know anxiety and, anxiety is high, not just for you, but obviously for many other folks. And this is something I talked about in the conference last week as well, is that a lot of folks actually do have a good deal of anxiety from last year. And to the point where we respectfully would ask people, if you feel that your anxiety is really getting to that point, it seems like a strange thing, but some actual folks we've seen an uptick in folks who have actually been seeking actual counseling and help because of almost PTSD type symptoms from last year, from going through all these storms. So bottom line, if you're in Louisiana, obviously you need to prepare, as folks in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Texas do every single year. Just, it's one of those things. I know it gets kind of old, but you kind of hope for the best, but you always need to prepare for the worst. And if you're prepared, at least you'll have a plan in place so you'll know what to do if a storm threatens your area.
How about a 2-for-1 here? Nick Roy asking #Ian, is there going to be Saharan dust to contend with again? And then also Dan Stanley here, #Ed, do you think we will get the dust storms off of Africa. So our first couple of Saharan dust questions coming in here.
That was all the rage at this point last year.
It
was those big plumes that came off of Africa in June and July and helped keep things suppressed. I mean, Saharan dust is our friend. We always like seeing a lot of that because it means tropical activity will stay low. I actually have not seen the latest look at that, Ed, but I know it's not like last year.
No, it's not. But, typically, one of the things that the Hurricane Center mentioned was a more active African monsoon season. And typically when we start seeing that, you'll get these monsoon, these storms over Africa that will kick up a lot of dust out ahead of them. So, early in the season, you mentioned last year, I remember seeing those maps of brown dust all over the Atlantic. And yeah, we're not really seeing too much of that, but yes, we will get periods throughout the course of the season where we'll get, more dust than normal. But like Ian said, dust tends to suppress tropical activity. So it's very dry air in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere that really tend to kind of put a cap on things. So again, the more dust, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And they provide some pretty nice sunsets when they make it to the Gulf Coast too.
Yeah, the sunset pictures are outrageous. Donna Simon asking #Hey Ed, how many category 3 or higher storms are projected this season? Category 3, Category 4, Category 5 storms are, of course, considered to be major hurricanes. This question for Ed Bloodsworth.
Yep, major hurricanes, 3 to 5 is the prediction from NOAA, right at 4 from Colorado State, which again, it would be a slightly above average year. That denotes that. But one thing, again, I mentioned it early in the stream and that we learned last year, do not make your plans for a storm solely dependent on the category, because that is a very big misnomer, because a slow moving category 1, category 2, or even a tropical storm, as we learned with Allison back in the early 2000s in Texas, that never became a hurricane, but it was a high impact flood event. And unfortunately, dozens of folks lost their lives because of flooding. Again, wind is one aspect of a storm, and that's what the category is based off of, wind speed. But you got to consider the surge. You have to consider the inland flood threat as well. So even if you live along a river, creek, stream, if you live along those major river basins or areas that just tend to flood easily from a good rainstorm, just keep in mind, wind is only one aspect from a hurricane. There are a lot of more significant impacts, and most of the fatalities every year from a tropical system don't come from the wind or the tornadoes. It comes from the surge and freshwater flooding.
The final question we're going to be taking on this edition of Tracking the Tropics, our season kickoff, if you will, here for the 2021 hurricane season. It comes from Bobby Shehorn, #KJB. Are we going to get our second named storm? I don't have a degree in meteorology. I don't have a seal from one of the organizations that give out seals to broadcast meteorologists. And I can tell you, yes, we are going to get our second named storm. The big question, of course, is when. When are we going to get our second named storm? When are we going to get Bill? When does Bill arrive? Ian, what do you think? Do you have a crystal ball?
Pretty good bet there, JB. If you could take those odds, you would want that bet. But again, we saw a preseason storm. Mm-hmm. This typically is the time of the year where we start slow. It's not an even distribution of named storms over the course of the season. You can see that spike up towards the peak September the 10th, where we see most of the activity, 2/3 of all named storms just in those 2 months, August and September. So oftentimes that was a bit of the discussion. That was interesting from a stat standpoint and also from a sociological standpoint when the National Hurricane Center was saying, hey, we're actually seeing some preseason storms 7 years in a row now. Maybe we should bump up the start of hurricane season. That's being discussed. But one of the things that is essentially a counterpoint to that is the lull to sleep effect, for lack of a better term. We start the season May the 15th, and then the first 2 months go by, June and into July, and we haven't had much in terms of named storms. Even if an active season is forecast, people say, hey, we're 2 months into hurricane season, nothing's happened. We're all set here. That couldn't be farther from the truth. So that is something that's being taken into consideration. So just because we did have 1 week preseason storm, but if you don't see a lot of activity in the next month, 2 months, that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with what the season's going to look like as a whole, because of typically what a season looks like with that big spike in the middle.
Yeah, and since we're on the subject of names, another interesting, change this year is that last year we had Greek alphabet storms. This year we will not. Greek alphabet is no more. If we hopefully we don't. But if this ever happens again, we make it and exhaust the entire first list of names. We will move then to a secondary list of names that will follow from year to year. And if you get strong storms, those names will be replaced. And so again, Greek alphabet is no more. But again, hopefully we don't ever have to exhaust the primary list of names again. I think all of us on the Gulf Coast and Florida and the Eastern Seaboard will sleep a lot easier knowing that we don't have to talk about multiple systems in the Atlantic Basin.
We'll end out on a really nice comment from one of our Tracking the Tropics fans out there, Rubel Melendez. A lot of new people, and this is very true, a lot of new people have moved into Florida this past year. I hope people learn to follow, this is very kind, I hope people learn to follow hashtag HJB and Weather Team. It's excellent education for all. Again, I'll hit the applause button here for our wonderful commenters here who were very, very kind in the social media comment section. It's really hard to find kind comments on social media, but you know what? We get some really great comments here.
Once in a while, you get lucky.
Yeah, once in a while.
We didn't have an applause button back in season 1 either, so that's the work of this guy over here.
That's what we're doing here. Let's give just a friendly reminder that we are here every Wednesday. Not this week, with the exception of this week. We're going to be here every Wednesday over the course of the 2021 hurricane season. We're going to have different meteorologists join us from across the country, across Nexstar Nation, our parent company here, providing us with a lot of different meteorologists, a lot of different a plethora of experience from all the weather teams that we have here in markets across the country. A perfect example, Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth joining us from WKRG in Mobile, Alabama today, an area that saw a lot of storms in the 2020 hurricane season. So we're going to have a whole lot more live discussions. We're going to be taking your questions on social media. And of course, we are going to be live when storms form. So that's an important part about Tracking the Tropics, is that when we have something to track, we're here for you live in your hurricane headquarters. So regular episodes on Wednesdays to talk about hurricane preparedness, hurricane education, what we do as far as studying storm formation in the Atlantic hurricane season. Then, of course, we have our storm coverage streams where we're going to be providing you with coverage when storms do form and pose a threat to the United States. So we have a lot of meteorologists, a lot of great discussions to get to. And for all the questions that we missed with hashtag HeyJB, hashtag HeyEd, hashtag HeyIan, join us on Wednesday, June 9th for the next episode. I believe that I have that right. It's right. Wednesday, June 9th. It is Wednesday, June 9th. Not tomorrow, but the following Wednesday for the next edition of Tracking the Tropics. We're going to have, of course, another discussion. I think one of the discussions that we're going to have coming up is just how accurate are the season forecasts from NOAA, the National Hurricane Center, and from Colorado State. We're going to kind of look back at the last 10 years, 2010 to 2020, and see just how accurate they were with their preseason forecast. That's coming up in a future edition of Tracking the Tropics as we tap into some more of the weather resources that we have here across the United States. So I'd like to thank Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth joining us from WKRG News 5 in Mobile, Alabama. Of course, you'll be seeing quite a bit of him, as well as Tracking the Tropics meteorologist Ian Oliver here with you in your hurricane headquarters at WFLA News Channel 8 in Tampa, Florida. I'm JB Buno. We'll see you next time, Wednesday, June 9th, or sooner if something pops up here on Tracking the Tropics.